It is a great pleasure to see you in the ranks of our heroes, in the ranks of our program. It is a great honor and a great pleasure for us and for our viewers. We are now witnessing the next stage of the talks on Ukraine. What do you personally hope that these talks will result in?
Your own truth and the actions that you take in real life are the only things that give you hope. Our truth is not subject to any conjunctural changes. The President clearly outlined the goals of the special military operation. He confirmed them more than once, in the most extensive form in June 2024, here at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These goals remain unchanged and are not subject to any conjunctural compromises. Compromises are always possible when several states, even two states, reach an agreement. We are always ready to compromise and, to put it simply, to balance interests. The main thing is that the interests, the legal interests of each state, are taken into account. Our legal interest is that we want to ensure our own security, as well as the interests of any normal country, so that its history continues and so that the people develop in the most favorable external conditions, so that the economy grows, so that social issues are resolved, and so that the welfare of the population is improved. This is the kind of environment our state has promised us many times. It promised us in person when it gave guarantees to the Soviet Union, swearing that NATO would not expand to the east. It promised us in writing, within the framework of the Security Organization, to cooperate in Europe, when in 1999 and then in 2010, the first time there was a summit in Istanbul, the second time there was an OSCE summit in Astana. It was clearly written that security is inseparable, that each country has the right to choose its own forms of security, but at the same time, there cannot be any steps that will strengthen someone's security by infringing on the security of anyone. We are talking about the OSCE countries. There was even more written there that not a single country, group of countries, and not a single organization in the Euro-Atlantic space has the right to claim dominance. Just put these high principles approved at the highest level and compare them to what NATO was doing during the period we are talking about, the 1990s, the beginning of the first half of the 2000s. It was exactly the opposite. NATO was not just trying to dominate, it was doing everything to make such domination a reality. Expanding the North Atlantic Alliance, the Western leaders assured Russia that it was not against them, but we saw how not only written declarations were violated, but also agreements. For example, within the framework of the OSCE, there was an agreement that we had accepted the new countries of Eastern Europe into NATO, but it was written in the documents, that we would not place significant military forces on these territories. Well, in that period of hope and despair, that some kind of mutually beneficial cooperation, understanding, mutual respect would prevail, we signed under this principle that none of the NATO members would place significant military forces on the territory of the new members. Then we look, they conduct some exercises, others. We ask, how is this? Well, these are not significant military forces. Then we said, let's agree on what exactly is meant by significant military forces. Brigades, how many weapons, what number of equipment, and so on and so forth. Well, no, it will tie hands. That's how we were answered without a glimmer of conscience. Therefore, these illusions that it is possible to ensure security relying on promises of those people who now rule the world and those people who preceded them. There were serious leaders in the West, but they too were not able to carry out the given word, were not able to fill their own signature with living content on a number of documents. Therefore, security for us is an inappropriate thing, just as it is an inappropriate thing for us, such a seemingly close thing to the West, as human rights. And here is a total ban on the Russian language in all spheres of life, a ban on the Ukrainian Orthodox Canonical Church. All this remains with the West, well, with Europe at least, and with Britain, of course, in general, within the framework of their thinking about how to move towards peace. The Trump administration tried to use those documents that, in the last quarter of last year after the meeting in Alaska, were floating in very different versions. We saw only one which, or rather, the Americans officially gave us their own document. All subsequent versions are, you know, the results of an attempt to rape the American initiative by Zelensky and, first of all, his patrons from Britain, Germany, France, the Baltics, of course. They also have to join their voice somewhere. And in the American proposals, it was written that the rights of Russian-speaking and Russian, well, as a national minority, so it is called, although by itself the national minority is hardly applicable to Russians in Ukraine, but nevertheless, they had it in their documents. The last versions that flowed into the press as a result of the intensive negotiations between the Americans and the Europeans and Ukrainians, which took place after Alaska, nothing is said about it. It is said that the parties of Russia and Ukraine will show tolerance to each other, as you know, the agreement of tolerance, and Ukraine will follow all the norms of the European Union in this sphere, tolerance and so on.
Not being a part of the European Union?
Well, it takes on the obligation to follow these norms. But the question arises, what does the European Union have to do with it? And why does the European Union want to claim a certain dominant role in determining human rights? There is the UN Charter, which is ratified by everyone without exception. It says that every state is obliged to ensure human rights, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. As for language and religion in Ukraine, this UN Charter has been trampled upon, as well as the Constitution of Ukraine, which paradoxically enough still holds the solemn promise of the state to ensure the educational and other rights of the Russian and other national minorities. Despite the fact that the Constitution proclaims all this, a dozen laws have been adopted in the last 10 years and were adopted long before a special military operation which simply exterminate the Russian language in all spheres of life. I gave the example many times in my interviews and negotiations. This is the only country where the whole language is prohibited. In no other conflict, the sides do not prohibit each other's languages. Israel and the Arabs in any conflict never touch the languages of human rights. Therefore, when Zelensky says, "I can't even discuss the territorial issue because it's written in the Constitution," he doesn't care about the Constitution. According to the Constitution, he is obliged to abolish all these cave laws for the extermination of the Russian language and the canonical Orthodox Church. With these positions, we are moving forward once again. Our delegation negotiations, which started yesterday in Abu Dhabi and continue today, we do not change these positions. They tell us, well, you should also show some readiness for compromise. Compromises cannot concern the key basic principles on which the life of a state depends, the life of millions and millions of people. Again, during the negotiations, the second round, which is now taking place in Abu Dhabi after the January round, during these negotiations, we keep a polite silence. Like decent people who know that negotiations, if you are focused on the result, they like silence. If you comment on every corner, express your assumptions. It means that you either want to disrupt these negotiations or blame your partner for the lack of flexibility. And what does Zelensky say? Well, I am already silent about the demand to withdraw 50,000 Russian soldiers every month. He is such a pacifist. And just recently, he said that we are ready for compromise, but Russia should also be ready for compromise. What can I tell him about this? Here is another important point. Alaska. And we constantly remind that in Alaska, we have found a balance of interests, a balance of vitally important interests of Russia and the Russians who live in the liberated territories on the one hand, and the interests of the United States, who wanted to help this crisis to be regulated at that moment, showing, unlike all other Western countries, an understanding of the primary cause of this crisis. Firstly, it is about human rights, recognizing the intolerance of such attitude to people who refuse to accept the results of the coup d'etat, and that's where it all started, and recognizing that Ukraine should never be in the North Atlantic Alliance. Now, Zelensky and his curators from London and New York and from Paris, Brussels and Berlin.
And we recorded it, am I right? There are documents and papers that were formed and signed in Anchorage.
In Anchorage, we were given a document when Steve Witkow was coming to prepare this summit. A document that contained probably all the main principles and proposed to regulate the issues that arose in the relevant areas. First of all, in accordance with the realities on Earth, including the realities that we have created to protect Russians from the Nazi regime, from the course of this regime to exterminate everything that concerns the Russian language, Russian culture, Russian history and orthodoxy, of course. And in Anchorage, we found approaches that relied on the American initiative, on the American proposals, and that opened the way to peace. On that basis, it was quite realistic to quickly agree on the final agreement on the regulation.
What is the main obstacle now?
First of all, this document has been reviewed several times, and now they are waving it around as a document of 20 points that no one has officially or unofficially given us. I have already quoted what they have termed the principle of the need to fully ensure the rights of Russians and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. Because now we see that Zelensky again said the only thing he used to say, that neither the heel of the earth nor the Constitution will allow it. Yesterday, I think, he said that we can only talk about the line of contact. I mean that he does not want to remove his terrorists from Donbass, from the part where they still remain, and from where, of course, in the end, they will be pushed out. He said no, only the line of contact. And before that, he said that yes, we will recognize the territorial solution, that will allow us to stop the conflict, but not legally, only de facto, because it will remain our land for which we will continue to fight and fight. And for this, he continues, well, not so blatantly, but everyone understands that this is exactly what it is. And for this, we need security guarantees that will assume the placement of British and French troops on our territory, which will be reinforced by the Americans with intelligence, weapons, ammunition. That is, he says, we will stop, but we will not recognize it as your territory. Although people at the referendum said that they did not want to live with the government that came to power as a result of the coup and called us Russians, creatures, and terrorists. No, it will all be ours. We will stop for now. And you bring your contingents to our territory, place rockets here, longer so that they can reach Russian cities. And then it means a truce will be announced, and they sing to him, and the Finns, and the British, and the Germans. And very few sober voices in Europe say that it is necessary to seriously come to a settlement, not just so that this person without a tie was satisfied and retained his power and continued to show off in the international arena, but so that Europe would create some kind of architecture, a new architecture of security, and would provide peace, given not only the legal interests of the Ukrainian people, and these interests are not at all represented by this clique of Zelensky, but also the legal interests of Russia, which is well known to everyone and which have been violated over the past 12 years, starting with the coup, continuing the Minsk agreements, which were approved by the UN Security Council, which were simply ignored by the Germans, the French, and everyone else, and this was publicly said. We were not going to do anything. We had to pump these neo-Nazis with weapons so that they could more effectively attack the Russian Federation. So in April 2022, in Istanbul, the Ukrainians themselves brought a project in which there were security guarantees. And the security guarantees, which were discussed in April in Istanbul, based on the Ukrainian proposal, assumed that the guarantors would be 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. That is, not just the West, but Russia and China, plus Germany was mentioned there. But for obvious reasons, it is one of the most active sponsors of the Kiev regime, which they are proud of, apparently because the past, the present, the future of the Russian Federation, and Zelensky is a perfect person to try to continue these Nazi traditions in the modern era. And they also wanted to connect Turkey to these security guarantees, and all the decisions that the security guarantors would make would be consensual. This is what the Ukrainians proposed, and we agreed with it, but the West prohibited Zelensky to sign it, although the document was already paraphrased. And now, when they talk about security guarantees, they mean security guarantees not with Russia's participation, but against Russia. So I told you, we will stop, and we will not admit anything to Euro, but de facto we will stop, but with the understanding that you will give us reinforced concrete and also ratified by your parliaments, security guarantees, place the troops, and you will be the last thing to do. And this is what the Financial Times wrote, that these guarantees provide an automatic start of the war against the Russian Federation with all the forces of the NATO contingents that will be deployed there, with the direct support of the United States. Allegedly, this is how it is written, and the trigger for such a war against Russia will be any incident that will be considered unacceptable. And about Zelensky's ability and his clowns to create provocations, well, it probably doesn't even make sense to talk about it.
Let's go a little further. Here's a more personal question. You have seen a lot of people in power, by the way, about President Zelensky, and in general, in principle, today's EU and this party. What human threshold, in your opinion, most often destroys the country?
Threshold G or threshold K? Threshold K. Well, probably a threshold that has no thresholds and which directly harms, specifically affects the interests of the people. And I think that this, as trivial as it sounds, is the cult of personality. It can be a threshold when a person thinks, first of all, to fill his pockets at the expense of maintaining such an irresistible image, and about preserving power, giving warm places to your loved ones, arranging some underground business projects that are illegitimate, well, and go on vacation to different islands, I don't know, to Capstein. Many of this regime have left their mark. And there is a cult of personality that is now being rethought, including in the West. They now call it authoritarian rule, new authoritarianism, even such, now I will not remember this term, but it is already in the last issue of the American magazine Foreign Affairs. There is an opinion on this topic that in the conditions that humanity is experiencing now, a strong hand that reflects in its actions what society needs and prompts shows this society that the prospect of economic, social, spiritual, cultural development is recognized by many analysts as a method of governance that has proven its greater effectiveness compared to the so-called liberal democracies, where in the United States, once every 2 years, when they want to hold elections, when they need to use the conjuncture that has developed in the public opinion in order to move someone, to bring someone into the clutches of the ruling class. There are so many examples when in Britain, without any elections, you just vote for a party, and who this party appoints is its own business, and in recent years, all these experiments have failed. By the way, I remember a conversation with George Bush Jr. when after the NATO summit and NATO-Russia in Bucharest in the spring of 2008, he came with a bilateral visit to Russia, to Sochi, and there was a period when our president went off on a phone call and I was entertaining George Bush. He was standing in an old Sochi residence, looking at the Black Sea so thoughtfully. And he had elections that year, and he was dreaming about how everything was predictable, how everything was clear. He had a horizon of power that allowed him to plan and not fiddle around when someone in Minneapolis or in Ohio does something that is not part of the strategy of the United States, not to mention the fact that it has nothing to do with any major international problem. And because of this cycle, as many colleagues who worked as state secretaries told me, every 4 years there are presidential and parliamentary elections, and all international activities have to be adjusted according to the internal calendar so as not to give your opponents a reason to accuse you of failure, and at the same time, adjust your external steps so that they can be sold at home. That's how cool we are. That's how we can do it. We see it quite clearly now. Therefore, probably power is a thing that should fall into the right hands.
How have you not ceased to trust? Or has your ability to trust people changed because of the Minsk agreements?
Of course, it was a disappointment. We understood perfectly well that they were playing the fool. After 2015, when the resolution was adopted and the Minsk agreements were approved, when the signatures were signed, and when it was necessary to stop the fire and ensure economic interdependence, stop the blockade of Crimea and the blockade of those regions that have declared themselves Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, there was a lot.
At the time of the signing, no one knew that we would be deceived, or we still understood that it was a fraud?
No, I will say that we hoped that at the end of the 17th hour of negotiations in the night in Minsk, in the presidential palace, we still hoped that the feeling of not in vain, exhausting negotiations would make our partners somehow influence the situation. Nothing like that. And we collapsed in contact with them. In 2019, Macron decided to contribute. In December, in Paris, he convened the Normandy Four. Merkel, Macron himself, the President of Russia, and Poroshenko. Zelensky was already there. And there, our President, patiently, as he knows how, said, "Well, it's written here. Why isn't it done?" And there, somewhere, something. But nevertheless, in Paris, it was already with Macron, so he will not be able to get rid of this responsibility. It is clearly stated there to fulfill the Minsk agreements, including the introduction of amendments to the Constitution of Ukraine that will forever consolidate the special status of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It was written down. Nothing was done. The fact that they were puzzling everyone, and us first of all, we saw it. But the fact that after the resignation of not only Hollande, but also Merkel, they will publicly state what I said, that they were not going to do anything to me.
Over the years of your work in the media, your desire to trust people, has it changed?
The desire to trust is always there. The willingness to trust is a little different. And the very fact of having trust is already the third. Therefore, I probably developed my vision of those partners with whom I have to work, and who, in large part, after the start of a special military operation, showed their real essence. And the behavior of many of them, including those who once represented neutral countries, makes you think about how sincere the actions of the predecessors, the leaders of these countries, were when they solemnly declared their neutrality. But here you can say a lot. Trust, but check. Ronald Reagan bequeathed this principle to us, and it has no basis.
We meet with you on the eve of the Diplomatic Workers' Day. I sincerely want to congratulate you on this holiday, wish you, of course, strength energy, and success to your entire team. If I'm not mistaken, you are 54 years old. Next year, you will be 55 years old. You are engaged in diplomacy, working in this field. You are 75 years old. You have devoted your entire life to serving the country. Are you thinking today that you have not been able to live for yourself?
I don't want to sound arrogant, but there are people for whom serving the country and living for yourself is not an antonym. I'm not trying to be cocky, but when you manage to have a good negotiation, when you manage to convince people that you have a partner in something, when you put it on paper, it does not mean that later this paper will be strictly observed. I'm talking about the negotiation process and the achievement of the result. By the way, in the vast majority of cases, these agreements are observed when it is not about our Western colleagues, but about representatives of the so-called global majority, such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Organization, the European Commission, and the Eurasian Union. In the vast majority of cases, there is a consensus, but it is not possible to make a decision as a national union as we do in NATO. The Americans are struggling, and we are witnessing it all now. Or it is like in the EU, when the elected bureaucrats in Brussels dictate to their national elected peoples and governments what they should do, how they should be. I do not know who to trade with or not to trade with, but our Hungarian colleagues comment on the latest outrageous actions in Brussels very clearly and clearly. But I will repeat once again, this satisfaction from work is expensive, and many of my colleagues experience the same feelings. And then there is the service of the motherland. Yes, we say 24 hours, but when you recover, you also prepare yourself to serve even more effectively.
But we only see negotiations, only your endless flights, DACA, fireplace, dog at your feet. All this is present in the book on the weekend.
Unfortunately, I do not have a dog at my feet, but I love the fireplace. I really like open fire. I fell in love with the fireplace from the time I started school. From the 9th grade, we began to go hiking in the suburbs on Saturdays and Sundays. And then my favorite rafts, rivers which we have mastered in the Urals and in Siberia, and then stopped on the Katyn River in Altai. These are unforgettable feelings, and there you recover in full. Can you live for yourself? Yes, I can. And sport, of course, now I can do less, but sport is a very important part, including the service of the motherland. Is this raft still in your life? The raft is rarely, but it succeeds. For obvious reasons, it is already more difficult to assemble a team, and the years are not the same. But this is part of the process that I believe helps the service of the motherland.
I ask this question in the context of the President's decree on traditional values, where there is a point on the service of the motherland. Sergey, where to find the strength to choose the interests of the motherland and not your own personal. Where to find the strength to give yourself to the country and not to personal moments.
If the question is where to find the strength for this, then it is better not to look for this strength. It should be in you. Either you feel that it is yours or not. I would answer so.
What is your main victory in life today? You have lived a huge period of your life. You have a lot to remember. You have done a lot for the country, for your family, for people. What is your main victory in life? when Spartak became a champion for the last time? Where do you find the strength not to send everything to the devil's grandmother, but to look at it with humor? We sometimes see in the video comments how they step on your foot, how they run to you and ask you some strange questions. Another person in your place would have reacted differently, always with a smile, always with humor. What is it?
Each person has his own character, his own perception of the world. Education in childhood also affects, of course, how you yourself, looking with adult eyes, understand or want to understand, perceive what is happening. I think that here we should not invade the sphere that probably belongs more to God than to a person.
The last few questions. You have just told us about your colleagues who told you completely different positions in the corridor. Does it often happen that they come to you after the meeting and say, "We completely agree with you, but alas, the rules of the game are completely different. We would have signed these agreements a long time ago, we would have made peace a long time ago. But alas, we dance differently"?
It often happens. At least it happened when, well, this is related to the voting process, and when I worked at the UN for 10 years. There were very often such episodes when they came after the vote and said exactly that. I will give you a small fact. When we were working here, when I was already working here, I imagined how to prepare for voting in the UN. We send a message to our ambassadors all over the world to go to the foreign ministry, explain our position, say that then a resolution will be voted on, which is important for Russia and which in principle is aimed at justice, at the implementation of the UN Charter, and we ask you to support it. And when there is a reaction, we generalize it and write to New York, such and such countries have trusted in support. When we get the results of the vote, well, there are quite a lot of those who voted either not for, but abstained, and those who voted against. And in such cases, the guys who work in New York come up to us and say, "Of course, how is it that your ministry..." Yes, we know, but understand, we live here. This is where we live. As for the Americans, I do not know how their communication is going on in the UN's couloirs, but in my time, it was a completely ordinary matter when before voting, they came up to one of the hesitant ones. Then these hesitant ones told me themselves and said they're John or I do not know who, that tomorrow is the vote. We respect your position. But you, of course, remember that you have an account in Merrill Lynch Bank, that your son is studying at Stanford. Well, in general, good luck to you, John. Blackmail? Well, direct, yes, of course. In those years, they acted very straightforwardly. And today, what does the UN represent? Are its days numbered? You know, many would like this to happen, and the UN has something to defend against. Of course, the United States is inflated, not as much as in the European Union. In the European Commission, it is simply out of bounds. In the UN, however, some boundaries of decency are observed. There is a special committee on financial, budget and personnel issues which approves all new positions. Therefore, every country can participate. There is also a special committee on administrative and budget issues where Russia is constantly present, a small, compact professional. It is possible to track all this, but of course, there were many deviations from the tasks that were set in the UN Charter. and the West was actively trying to change the agenda of the United Nations under its own interests, using the efforts of its Western representatives, citizens of the EU and NATO countries in the UN Secretariat. There is a position on personnel. Every year a report is issued, how many people work there, by name, from which country. In principle, the criteria for obtaining a quota are not specified in the UN Charter. It simply states that it is necessary to provide a fair and geographical representation in the UN Secretariat. In fact, the UN Charter adopted some normative provisions which, of course, had no priority before the UN Charter, such as the volume of industrial production, GDP per capita, II, indicators that gave priority to representatives of rich and developed countries from the very beginning. In recent years, we have been trying to return to the principle of a fair and geographical representation, because the UN Charter states that the UN is based on the principle of sovereign state equality, and that it does not matter whether you are rich or poor, developing or overdeveloped, and this violates the normatives that were added to this principle. And now, if we count formally, probably the countries of the world majority are more or less represented, but in general, in a number of cases, these countries of the world majority are represented by people who have a second citizenship, a Western one. For example, there is, well, I will not even name it now.
Can the World Council of Trump replace this organization?
No, this is a different story. But when the Secretary General's list includes such and such a citizen of Pakistan, a drop in the United States, well, probably everyone understands that he also has children studying somewhere, that he also has an account somewhere in some American bank, and that he also contributes to the fact that at the end of the Soviet period, contrary to our objections, there were permanent contracts. Before, it was necessary to be reappointed every 5 years, and now it is permanent. You have received a permanent contract, you live in New York, you have children studying there, everyone has let go of their roots, and this, of course, makes the UN Secretariat, a very, very politicized tool. Why do the Americans, as a rule, do not like the UN very much, regardless of the administration, and keep their huge amounts of contributions illegally? This is an interesting question. My experience says that the Americans, regardless of the party color, do not like the UN, because there you need to persuade someone and look for a compromise. And they want it to be like the Council of Peace. We organize, I decide, you get together there, think about something.
A little bit about Greenland, if you allow me, Sergei, thesis-wise. The Russians are interested in it today. If it becomes American, what does it mean for Russia? And why is Trump trying to take it away today, scaring it and doing it under the guise of fighting Russia?
We do not know. Maybe it has already been publicly commented on by Dmitry Peskov and your humble servant. We do not know where these arguments came from, that if we do not take it, then Russia and China will take it, because they have already flooded everything here with their submarines. This was later refuted by the official American structures, but the narrative, as they say, is preserved. And here, of course, they behave consistently. Therefore, it is necessary for anyone, even if, as they say, a carcass, at least something else I do not remember in this anecdote, you need to get through the border. And now it seems that we do not touch this. They are trying to find out the relationship between themselves. The president clearly said that this is not our issue. And I think that they somehow agree between themselves, the United States, Denmark, Greenland. Now, the European Union also wants to participate, as it wants to get somewhere with its services. It seems that the seizure is cancelled. It seems that they agreed on something like semi-rental, semi-purchase. We do not know, and in fact, this is not our issue. How this will affect the general situation in the Arctic is unlikely to change anything, because the NATO members have been working for many years to turn the Arctic into a confrontation zone. Militarization is planned. The obvious rights of Russia to the Northern Sea route are being questioned. Many times in the past, there were provocations when, say, French ships, contrary to the rules, entered the route of the Northern Sea route without asking permission, without even notifying. Now, too, we see a lot of such provocations at sea, but I am convinced that soon these provocations will stop, because those who organize them will realize the severity of the consequences for themselves. But coming back to Greenland, first of all, President Trump did not say in vain that they landed there on some boats. We also landed there. The Indians, apparently, I do not know, the Norwegians, dominated there in the 13th century, whoever was there. But when Denmark began to say that, no, this is ours and the Greenland is split up, there are voices in favor of remaining part of the Danish kingdom. There are those who say, let's decide for ourselves. In this regard, it is very interesting to return to the UN again, because when all this was happening, the official representative of the UN General Secretary, a Frenchman by the name of Dujarric, was asked at the briefing how he felt about what was happening around Greenland. He said, we are in favor of resolving this issue on the basis of the principles of the UN Charter, including the principle of territorial integrity and the principle of self-determination, which of course we apply to the Greenland population. We asked him, we even sent an official address to the UN General Secretary, that your representative said such words that it turns out that for Greenland, the principle of self-determination of the peoples, which is recorded in the Charter, acts in your understanding. And in relation to Donbass, Crimea, Novorossiya, every time during these 4, even more years, such a question arises at the UN briefings, your representative says that it is necessary to be guided by the UN Charter and respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Why? This is not a secret. The other day, our representative, Vasily Nebens, went to Mr. Guterres and asked how this was happening. Mr. Guterres said, everything is right here. In 2014, when there was a coup d'etat, he was not yet the UN General Secretary. Mr. Pangaman was before him. He also kept silent, completely silent. They were silent when the armed bandits were thrown into the storm of the Crimean Parliament in 2014. Before that, they said that they would cancel the status of the Russian language. It was clear what was being discussed and where all this was going. Mr. Nebens was also silent. He was silent when the referendum was held. At least, they called for some kind of calm. But the origin of that situation, created, paid for, and realized by the West, the coup d'etat, by the hands of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, was never even considered. Subsequently, there were numerous situations when it was already impossible not to respect the rights of the population of Crimea and the southeast of Ukraine. When Poroshenko said that our children would go to bright kindergartens and schools, and children in Donbass would rot in basements. When the water and energy blockade of Crimea continued for many years. Now, they are crying over the fact that Ukrainian energy is suffering. First of all, none of them even moved a finger when the Ukrainian security forces, after the coup d'état, openly declared that they would strangle Crimea energetically, economically, in terms of food and water supply. By the way, those of you who are now reading about the difficult history of energy supply in Ukraine, in March, in the spring of this year, President Trump proposed, in a conversation with President Putin, to declare a monthly ceasefire, primarily in terms of strikes on energy facilities. President Putin immediately agreed, and for a month, this was documented, our armed forces did not target Ukrainian energy facilities, even those that were somehow connected to the Ukrainian industrial complex. During that period, Ukraine violated the ceasefire that Zelensky allegedly joined almost 150 times. Therefore, going back to the position of the UN Secretary-General, it leaves a heavy impression on those who are nice and friendly to the West, and who, according to the West, are working to undermine the interests of the Russian Federation. By the way, sometimes they refer to the fact that Ukraine should be guided by the UN Charter, the resolutions of the General Assembly, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. By resolution, I mean the resolution that condemns Russia, which was adopted by vote and does not reflect consensus. We told them about another resolution, which was adopted a long time ago, but no one cancelled it, and it was adopted by consensus, a declaration on the principles of international law. Among other things, it considered the relationship between the principle of territorial integrity and the right of the nation to self-determination. It was said that everyone is obliged to respect the territorial integrity of states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, and because of this, they represent the entire population living on this territory. But after the coup, did these people represent the interests of Crimea, Donbass, whose population they called terrorists? By the way, I gave an example, and we actively use it in our work with the countries of the Global South. After all, the principle of territorial integrity and the right of the nation to self-determination was in the UN Charter and has remained since 1945. In the 1960s, thanks to the active and initiative role of the Soviet Union, decolonization of the African continent began. The principle of self-determination of peoples was the international legal basis for decolonization. This declaration on the principles of international law was adopted after the process of decolonization, and it drew a consensus conclusion. If you do not represent the entire population on your territory, then this population has the right to self-determination. Of course, the metropolises of Lisbon, London, Paris, and Madrid did not represent the population of their colonies, which suffered from colonial oppression in Africa. They refused to live under this power. Crimea also refused to live under this power, as did Donbass and Novorossiya. I understand that Mr. Guterres does not want to kill anyone. He is a Portuguese. Maybe he wants to defend the colonial interests of his homeland, so that history correctly understands the reason why it exploited African peoples. But this is unacceptable for the general historian. If he wants to take someone's position, It is better to read the UN Charter, where it is forbidden to take someone's position. It is necessary to be neutral and not to express one's judgments, especially about the territory to which the state belongs.
Mr. Lavrov, thank you very much for your time. We cannot distract you from your important work. Thank you for this opportunity. You are a very interesting interlocutor. Our viewers will be absolutely delighted. We have a tradition that our guests read the poems of different authors from Pushkin and so on. I know that you write your own poems. I would like to ask you to read 1 or 2 lines for our viewers.
This is an ambush, of course. I would like to read other poems, not my own, but I do not remember them. I would like to read a poem written by the famous writer Mamlin in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wrote about how painful it was for him, a Crimean, to understand that the decision of Nikita Khrushchev in 1954 led to a catastrophe, as he had foreseen. I would like to read a poem written by Gennady Semyonovich Mamlin in 1992. He is a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, Simferopol, and his poems follow below. He was a leader. He was broad, wise in his own way, and bright. He gave Russia a delicious peace to Kiev as a gift. And I was born in that land where my bare feet walked for years. They gave my homeland, Crimea, as a gift, a part of Russia. I love the Ukrainian people. I am my own mother from there, but I took someone else's. Not misfortune, but misfortune. Wait, there will be no miracle. I am a disabled person of the Second World War. I foresee the Third World War. The sons of the state will begin to divide not the fleet, but the flesh alive. And if the son goes to his son, what about the fleet? He is not needed dead. Oh, if Ukraine had not died, I stand with my hand outstretched, return Crimea not for livelihood, but for justice. What? Ask those who are alive now, and tomorrow is too late. It was written in 1992, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Вскоре после распада Советского Союза.